When you say that 1% of ancient Egypt has been discovered, what do you really mean by that?
Ancient Egyptian pharaohs weren't just rulers, they were living gods, and they acted like it. From wearing fake beards to staging elaborate animal funerals and even marrying their siblings, their lives were anything but ordinary. And let's just say they would do basically anything for their bloodline, even marrying their own family. It sounds bizarre today, but back then, it was a power move. The elite weren't just doing this for fun. They had serious reasons, even if the side effects weren't great. And if we're talking about royal family drama, King Tut's parentage is basically the poster child for this whole phenomenon. So, why did they do it? Well, Egyptian pharaohs were seen as living gods, and gods in their mythology married their siblings all the time. Osiris and Isis were brother and sister, and their son Horus was super important. That kind of divine setup gave kings and queens an excuse to keep their bloodline pure and their power close. Marrying outside the family meant bringing in outsiders who might challenge their rule. And that was a big no-no. This wasn't just a random phase either. Some of the most famous rulers did it. Akhenaten, Tut's dad, likely married his own sister. Ramses II, one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, supposedly married a few of his daughters. And while all of this sounds straight out of a scandalous tabloid, for them, it was just part of ruling a kingdom. But before you assume every Egyptian was out there marrying their siblings, hold up. This was pretty much exclusive to royalty. Regular folks weren't doing this. It wasn't a common thing in everyday Egyptian society. The whole sibling marriage practice was a royal privilege, not a cultural norm. The elites thought of themselves as special, separate from the rest of society, so their marriage rules didn't apply to the average person. Now, back to King Tut, whose family tree was basically a tangled mess. DNA testing on his mummy and others from his family confirmed that his parents were most likely full siblings. That explains a lot about the health problems he had. Tut was far from the picture of a strong, mighty ruler. He had a clubfoot, a cleft palate, and a bunch of other health issues, which were probably made worse by generations of inbreeding. Some historians argue that his mum might have been Nefertiti, Akhenaten's main wife, who was technically his cousin. If that were the case, it would mean Tut's parents were still closely related, but not necessarily full siblings. Either way, this wasn't a genetic jackpot situation. The whole incest trend eventually backfired. Sure, it kept the royal bloodline pure in their eyes, but it also led to a bunch of genetic problems. When you keep marrying within the family, mutations and health defects pile up, making rulers physically weaker and possibly even shortening their lifespans. Tutankhamun was a prime example. His body showed evidence of all kinds of medical issues, and he died young, probably around 18 or 19. Well, it's clear there were some serious defects that came with keeping it in the family, one of them being elongated skulls. Yep, there's actual evidence that certain members of the ruling class had naturally different head shapes. The big question is, was this a genetic trait, a medical condition, or just artistic exaggeration? Turns out, it's a bit of all three. Akhenaten, the pharaoh who turned Egypt upside down with his religious reforms, is one of the most famous examples. If you look at statues and carvings from his reign, he's got a long, narrow head, an unusually long neck, and even some curiously feminine features. And it wasn't just him, his kids were depicted the same way. So, did he actually look like that? Or was this just some weird artistic choice? Scholars have debated this for years. Some think Akhenaten had a genetic condition called craniosynostosis, where the skull bones fuse too early, giving the head an elongated shape. Others point to a hormonal disorder called aromatase excess syndrome, which could explain not just his skull, but also his softer facial features and his daughters maturing unusually fast. If that's true, then his distinctive appearance wasn't just an artistic choice, it was real, and he probably passed those traits down to his children. And speaking of his kids, let's talk about King Tut. CT scans of his mummy show that he also had a slightly elongated skull. It wasn't as dramatic as his dad's, but it was definitely different from the average head shape. There's no evidence that Tut's skull was intentionally shaped like in some other cultures, so it's likely just something he inherited. Which makes sense, considering his parents were brother and sister. There wasn't exactly a wide gene pool to pull from. Some people see these depictions and immediately assume the Egyptians practiced cranial deformation, like in ancient Peru or Central Asia, where people actually bound babies' heads to shape them a certain way. But in Egypt, there's no real evidence of that. These elongated skulls seem to be specific to certain royal family members rather than a widespread cultural thing. That said, Akhenaten's reign did introduce a completely new art style, one that deliberately exaggerated physical features. Before him, Egyptian art followed a strict set of rules. Pharaohs looked strong, youthful, and idealized. Then Akhenaten came along and threw all that out. Suddenly, the royal family was being depicted with long heads, round bellies, and soft, curvy bodies. And if having distinct skull shapes wasn't enough, the Egyptian elite also had another defining feature: makeup. And not just the women. Both men and women used makeup. Ancient Egyptians took their makeup game seriously, and it wasn't just about looking good. Makeup had practical uses, spiritual meaning, and even some supposed health benefits. Both men and women were all in on this, smudging on eyeliner, dusting on colorful eyeshadow, and dabbing their lips with red pigment. Beauty routines in ancient Egypt weren't just a quick swipe of eyeliner and out the door. They had full-on skincare regimens, especially the wealthier folks. They exfoliated with Dead Sea salts, soaked in milk baths to keep their skin soft, and used honey and sugar to wax off unwanted hair. Honestly, a lot of their routines wouldn't be out of place in a modern spa. Once their skin was prepped, the makeup went on. And this is where things got serious. They used green malachite eyeshadow and thick black kohl eyeliner that extended way past the outer corners of their eyes, what we'd call a dramatic winged liner today. Kohl wasn't just for the aesthetic. It helped reduce glare from the sun and even kept flies away. Plus, they believed it had medicinal properties. Turns out, they might not have been totally wrong. Some studies suggest the lead compounds in kohl could have stimulated the immune system. Their black eyeliner, called mesdemet, came from ground-up galena or stibnite mixed with water or oils to create a smooth paste. The green eyeshadow, known as uju, was made from crushed malachite, a copper-based mineral. Red ochre, dug straight from the earth, was mixed into a paste for lips and cheeks. They weren't just slapping on whatever looked nice. These materials were carefully sourced and, in their eyes, had real benefits. Now forget the idea that makeup was just for women. In ancient Egypt, men were just as committed to their beauty routines. They wore kohl to define their eyes, used perfumes and scented oils to smell great, and paid attention to skin care just as much as women did. Cleanliness and self-care were huge cultural values, so putting effort into one's appearance wasn't seen as vain, it was expected. But beyond the practical and aesthetic reasons, makeup had deep spiritual meaning. They believed that adorning themselves wasn't just about personal style, it was a way to connect with the divine. Cosmetics were thought to offer protection from evil spirits, and many of the pigments had religious associations. They even buried people with their makeup palettes, because looking good in the afterlife was just as important as looking good in the real world. And while the Egyptians were all about looking good, they were also pretty inventive when it came to things like birth control. Let's just say their methods were creative. Their knowledge of medicine and biology wasn't bad for the time, and they even wrote some of their techniques down in medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus and the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus. But if you think modern contraceptives can be inconvenient, just wait until you hear what they were using. One of the more common methods was inserting various substances into the vagina to block sperm. These pessaries were made from all sorts of ingredients, some of which actually had some scientific backing. Acacia gum, for example, was used because it turns out it has spermicidal properties. Not bad. Then there was honey mixed with sodium carbonate, which was supposed to make the environment less hospitable for sperm. But then there was crocodile dung. Yeah, women would insert crocodile poop, possibly because it altered vaginal pH, though it's hard to say if it was really effective or just incredibly unhygienic. Aside from these more direct approaches, they also relied on extended breastfeeding as a natural way to prevent pregnancy. Women often nursed their babies for up to 3 years, which helped suppress ovulation and delay fertility. It wasn't foolproof, but it definitely helped. And then there were the more experimental techniques, like covering the cervix with various gummy substances to physically block sperm, or applying strange mixtures, hoping they'd do the trick. Some of these methods may have had mild effectiveness, while others probably just gave people a false sense of security. But the Egyptians didn't just rely on weird substances and creative biology, they also turned to magic. Magic wasn't just some secret art in ancient Egypt, it was a way of life. It wasn't about pulling rabbits out of hats, it was seen as a force that shaped the universe. The Egyptians believed magic, or Heka, was everywhere, influencing health, protection, government, and even the afterlife. It wasn't something separate from religion or medicine. It was woven into everything. The word Heka actually had a double meaning. It was both the concept of magic and the name of a god. Heka was believed to have existed before all other gods, making him the ultimate power behind creation. His name roughly translates to using the Ka, with Ka being a person's life force. Basically, the Egyptians saw magic as a way to tap into their own spiritual energy to change the world around them. Egyptians used magic for all kinds of things, but it usually fell into 2 categories: helpful magic and harmful magic. Protective spells and charms were common. People used them to ward off sickness, bad luck, and evil spirits. On the flip side, there was also destructive magic, used to cast curses or bring misfortune to enemies. While protective magic was widely accepted, anything that hinted at a curse was treated with fear and suspicion. Spoken words were a huge part of Egyptian magic. Spells weren't just fancy phrases, they were believed to have real power. The Book of the Dead, for example, was full of spells to help the dead safely reach the afterlife. Even hieroglyphs were considered magical since they were thought to be a gift from Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. Amulets were another staple of Egyptian magic. People wore them for protection, luck, or even healing. Scarabs symbolize rebirth, while other charms carry the power of gods like Isis or Horus. Priests and magicians also used wands, scepters, and other sacred objects to channel their power. One of the most fascinating things about ancient Egyptian rulers was how they used symbols to reinforce their power. And no one did this better than Hatshepsut. She wasn't just any pharaoh, she was one of the very few women to rule Egypt as a king. And to make sure people took her seriously, she rocked a very distinctive royal accessory, a fake beard. As a woman ruling in a world where pharaohs were expected to be men, she had to get creative. One of her boldest moves? Strapping on a fake beard. But this wasn't just for show. This was a calculated power move. In Egypt, beards weren't just about looking regal. They were symbols of divine authority, something every pharaoh was expected to have. The god Osiris, ruler of the afterlife, was always shown with a long, fancy beard, and pharaohs wore their own artificial versions to channel that godly energy. Hatshepsut, ruling in a time when being a female pharaoh was almost unheard of, made sure to follow tradition, but on her own terms. She wore the beard, dressed in masculine royal clothing, and essentially said, "Yeah, I'm in charge. Deal with it." Her rule began after the death of her husband-brother, Thutmose II. Technically, her stepson Thutmose III was next in line, but he was just a kid. Instead of acting as a passive regent, Hatshepsut declared herself pharaoh and ruled as Egypt's king, not its queen. She didn't just throw on the beard, she had herself depicted in statues and carvings with all the traditional pharaoh gear, blending her identity with what people expected from a ruler. But of course, history can be brutal. After her death, Thutmose III decided he wasn't a fan of her legacy and tried to erase her from history. He had her statues defaced, her name chiseled off monuments, and did his best to make it look like she never ruled at all. It didn't work. Archaeologists have since pieced together her story, and she's now recognized as one of the most successful and innovative pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Hatshepsut knew how to rule, but even pharaohs needed to unwind. And when ancient Egyptians wanted to kick back and relax, they didn't just sit around, they played board games. One of their favorite ways to pass the time, a board game called Senet. This wasn't just any old game. It was a mix of strategy, luck, and a dash of spiritual significance. Think of it as a mix between chess and a race game, with a side of divine intervention. Senet goes way, way back, over 4,500 years ago, give or take. That makes it one of the oldest known board games in history. It was so popular that even pharaohs and high-ranking officials were buried with their own boards, as if they planned to keep playing in the afterlife. Because in ancient Egypt, even board games were taken seriously. So, how did it work? The game board was a rectangle with 30 squares, arranged in 3 neat rows of 10. Each player had 5 pieces, and the goal was to move all of them off the board before your opponent. But this wasn't just about rolling some dice and hoping for the best. You had to think ahead, block your opponent, and sometimes get a little lucky. Instead of dice, players used casting sticks or knuckle bones, which worked kind of like dice, but with a more unpredictable element. Depending on how the sticks landed, you could move 1, 2, 3, or 4 squares forward. And if you rolled the perfect number, you got to go again. So sometimes, luck could give you a major advantage. Of course, just like in real life, not every move was a step forward. Some squares were blessed spots where you could pause and feel safe, while others were total disasters. Land on the wrong square, and you might get sent back to where you started, losing all your progress. The most dreaded of these was the House of Water, which basically acted like quicksand for your game piece. If you landed there, back you went, struggling to escape while your opponent raced ahead. But Senet wasn't just about having fun. The fancier Senet boards were made of wood, ivory, or even precious stone, decorated with hieroglyphs and religious symbols. But not everyone had an elaborate set. Some boards were just simple grids scratched into the floor, proving that this was a game for everyone, from workers to royalty. Of course, death wasn't just about playing board games in the afterlife. Getting there required one of the most intense processes ever: mummification. Mummification in ancient Egypt wasn't just about preserving a body. It was an intense, sacred process meant to prepare someone for the afterlife. And trust me, it wasn't pretty. Reserved mainly for royalty and high-ranking officials, because it wasn't exactly cheap. This procedure evolved over thousands of years. First, the body got a good wash with Nile water. This wasn't just to freshen things up. It helped prevent decay in Egypt's scorching heat. Then came the part that would make anyone squeamish: organ removal. The embalmers went straight for the brain first, and since they didn't think it was important, they yanked it out through the nose using a long metal hook. Some theories suggest they whisked it into a liquid before draining it. Either way, not a great time. The liver, stomach, intestines, and lungs followed, pulled out through a cut on the left side of the torso. Each organ was placed in its own canopic jar, guarded by a protective deity. The heart, that one usually stayed put. Egyptians believed it was the seat of intelligence and the soul. Next came the drying phase. The body was packed inside and out with natron, a natural salt that sucked out all the moisture. This step took over a month, with the embalmers swapping out the natron every few weeks. When they finally pulled the body out, it looked like a dried-out husk, so they had to plump it back up. They rubbed it down with fragrant oils, stuffed the skull and torso with linen or resin, and did their best to make it look somewhat lifelike. Then came the wrapping, a process so intricate it could take over 2 weeks. Hundreds of yards of linen strips were wrapped around the body, layer by layer, with protective amulets tucked in between. For royalty, they even slipped in some jewelry and sacred items for the afterlife. To top it off, the whole thing was soaked in liquid resin to keep everything in place. Mummification was all about ensuring a smooth journey to the afterlife, but not everyone got a peaceful send-off. Just ask the workers who built Akhenaten's city. Akhenaten, the infamous 18th dynasty pharaoh, wasn't exactly known for playing by the rules. Instead of sticking with tradition, he decided to shake things up by scrapping Egypt's long-standing religious system and creating an entirely new city dedicated to his favorite god, Aten. This wasn't just a minor shift. It was a full-blown religious revolution, and at the heart of it was Akhenaten, modern-day Amarna, a city built from scratch in the middle of nowhere. Why move the capital? Because Akhenaten wanted a fresh start, far from the influence of Egypt's powerful priests and their old gods. In the 4th year of his reign, around 1350 BCE, he picked a stretch of untouched desert on the east bank of the Nile and declared it the perfect place for his new religious utopia. He named it Akhenaten, meaning Horizon of the Aten, making it crystal clear that this was Aten's city and Aten's city alone. But here's the thing: building a brand new capital in the middle of nowhere was no small task. It took an army of laborers, artisans, and craftsmen to make Akhenaten's dream a reality, and their workload was brutal. Stone had to be quarried, massive temples and palaces had to be constructed, and everything had to be done fast. The phrase, "built on broken backs," isn't an exaggeration. Life for these workers was harsh, and the rapid pace of construction probably made it even worse. The city itself was designed to reflect Akhenaten's religious vision. Instead of the towering, enclosed temples that had been standard for centuries, Akhenaten's structures were open air, bathed in sunlight, perfect for worshipping Aten. The great temple of Aten stood at the city's heart, with sprawling courtyards and altars dedicated to the sun god. Nearby, Akhenaten's royal palace sat in all its glory. decorated with vibrant paintings and reliefs showing him and his family basking in Aten's divine light. The city's boundaries were even marked by massive stone slabs, or stelae, carved with declarations of Akhenaten's devotion to his god. For a brief moment, Akhenaten was the center of Egypt, a bold experiment in both religion and urban planning. But the moment didn't last. After Akhenaten died around 1332 BCE, his successors wasted no time undoing everything he built. They moved the capital back to Thebes, restored the old gods, and tried to erase Akhenaten's name from history. Without royal support, Akhenaten crumbled into ruin, abandoned and left for the desert. Akhenaten's grand vision for Akhenaten may have crumbled, but one thing that stuck around in ancient Egypt was their strange love for animals. Pets were everywhere, from bustling city homes to grand temples, and they weren't just for fun. These animals had deep cultural, religious, and even social significance. Cats were basically royalty. They weren't just cute and fluffy. They were protectors, keeping grain stores safe from rats and snakes. Egyptians believed cats had magical powers, and since they were linked to the goddess Bastet, harming one was a serious crime. Some cats were even mummified alongside their owners, which tells you just how much people loved them. Dogs were just as popular, though in a different way. They were hunters, guards, and loyal companions. Unlike cats, dogs actually had names, things like Brave One or Reliable, which says a lot about how Egyptians saw them. Certain breeds, like the Saluki and Greyhound, were prized for their speed and skill. And just like their feline friends, some dogs were mummified and buried with their humans. But Egyptians didn't stop at cats and dogs. They had pet birds, geese, ducks, falcons, even ibises, which were tied to the god Thoth. Some wealthy families kept gazelles, and if you were really powerful, you might even have a lion lounging around. Monkeys were another favorite, often dressed up and trained to entertain their owners. Pets weren't just for companionship, they had a spiritual role too. Cats symbolized protection, dogs were seen as loyal guardians, and falcons were tied to divine power. When an animal died, people didn't just move on. Many were given elaborate burials, complete with mummification, so they could stick with their humans in the afterlife. Do you think there are other weird facts about the pharaohs that no one knows about? Maybe they're still hidden, waiting for us to find them.